My family thought I would never wake up, so they stole my life savings and left me homeless. You ever wake up from a deep sleep, so disoriented that you don't know where you are? Imagine that, but 100 times worse. It started with headlights. Too bright, glaring orbs cutting through the dark, coming at me too fast. Then the deafening crunch of metal, the jolt of my body being thrown against my seatbelt, the sharp snap of something breaking, maybe a bone, maybe glass, maybe both. Then nothing. For the longest time, there was only darkness. No pain, no thoughts, no dreams. Just a void. I don't know if I was dead or just floating somewhere between life and whatever comes after. Then, out of nowhere, a sound. A rhythmic beep, slow and steady. Distant voices murmuring. The heaviness of something pressing down on me, like my own body was too much to bear. I tried to open my eyes, but it felt like my eyelids were made of lead. I wanted to move, to speak, to understand where I was and what had happened, but my body refused to cooperate. Time stretched. I drifted in and out of that dark, endless space, caught between reality and whatever limbo I had been stuck in. Until finally, I surfaced. The first thing I saw was light, bright, sterile, and blinding. White ceiling tiles so pristine they almost hurt to look at. The world around me was a blur at first, a mix of beeping monitors and quiet voices. I tried to move, but my body didn't respond the way I expected. My arms felt like dead weight, my legs unresponsive. Panic set in. Was I paralyzed? Why couldn't I move? Then a voice, gentle but firm. "You're awake." I turned my head, or at least I thought I did. The movement felt sluggish, like I was wading through thick mud. A nurse stood beside my bed, her expression carefully composed. Where my throat was so dry the word barely came out. It felt like I had swallowed sandpaper. She leaned closer. "You're in St. Luke's Medical Center. You were in an accident." An accident. The word echoed in my head. I searched my mind for memories, for anything that explained how I ended up here. And then, flashes. Headlights. The impact. The sickening sound of metal folding in on itself. "How long?" I croaked. The nurse hesitated, then said, 3 weeks. 3 weeks. My stomach twisted. 3 weeks of my life gone. I was in a coma. My mind raced with 1,000 questions, but only one made it past my lips. "Has my family been here?" I expected a yes. Of course, they'd been here. My mom, my dad, my younger brother, Chris. They would have been sitting by my bedside, waiting for me to wake up, worrying over whether I'd survive. Instead, the nurse hesitated. That tiny pause before she answered. That was the moment I knew something was wrong. "No, no one's been listed as your emergency contact." The words hit me like a second car crash. No one, not my parents, not my brother, not a single person had been here for me. I couldn't process it. My brain refused to accept it. There had to be a mistake. I licked my cracked lips, forcing myself to speak through the dry ache in my throat. "Are you sure?" Maybe they didn't know where I was. She shook her head, a sad look in her eyes. "The hospital contacted the number on your driver's license. No one ever called back. No one ever called back." My hands clenched into weak fists. I didn't understand. I had a family. They weren't perfect, but they were mine. My parents might not have been the most affectionate people in the world, but surely, if their son was in a coma, they would have cared, right? But they didn't. They left me here, alone. Recovery was brutal. When you're in a coma for weeks, your body starts to forget how to work. My muscles had weakened from lying in bed for so long. Even sitting up felt like running a marathon. The physical therapist had to guide me through the basics, lifting my arms, bending my legs, standing without collapsing. It was humiliating. I had always been independent, never the type to rely on others, and now I could barely hold a spoon. Every movement felt foreign, like I had been reborn into a body that no longer belonged to me. The worst part? The silence. Other patients had visitors, friends, family, people who brought them flowers and balloons and whispered reassurances at their bedside. I had nothing. Not one call. Not one message. Every day, I convinced myself that maybe they just didn't know. Maybe there had been some mix-up and the hospital had contacted the wrong people. Maybe my family had been looking for me this entire time, worried sick, trying to track me down. But deep down, I knew better. They had left me for dead. 2 weeks later, they discharged me. I still wasn't 100%, but I was stable enough to leave. They gave me a prescription for painkillers, a bag of personal belongings that had been salvaged from the accident, and a taxi voucher to get home. Home! The thought of it gave me hope. I just needed to get there. Maybe there was some explanation for all this. Maybe my family would be relieved to see me. Maybe I wasn't as alone as I felt. But when I arrived at my apartment, everything shattered. I stood in front of my door, heart hammering. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my keys, and slid one into the lock. It didn't turn. Confused, I tried again. Nothing. I knocked on my landlord's door. When he opened it, his face paled. "Oh my God," he blurted. "You're alive." A slow, suffocating dread wrapped around my chest. "What the hell do you mean?" My voice was sharp, but inside I was trembling. The landlord swallowed hard. "Your family, they came by a couple weeks ago. Said you weren't going to make it, that you've been moved to long-term care. They signed the papers to cancel your lease." The world spun. "They what?" "They cleared out your apartment," he said. "Took everything." I could barely breathe. My mind reeled, trying to piece together the reality I was standing in. They took everything. They emptied my apartment, terminated my lease, like I had already died. The realization hit me in full force. They thought I wouldn't wake up, and instead of waiting to see if I did, they helped themselves to my life. I staggered away from the door, hands shaking. I needed answers. I pulled out my phone and dialed my parents. No answer. I called my brother, Chris. The phone rang once, twice. Then he picked up. For a moment, there was silence. Then, in a hushed, disbelieving whisper, he said, "Oh my God, you're alive." And that was the moment I knew. This wasn't a mistake. They had been counting on me staying dead. The moment Chris said those words, my blood turned ice cold. Not, "Oh my God, we were so worried." Not, "We've been looking for you." Not even, "Where have you been?" Just, "You're alive." Like he never expected to hear my voice again. I didn't even get a chance to respond before the call cut off. He hung up. I stared at my phone, breathing heavily. My hands were still trembling, my heart hammering against my ribs. I redialed, but this time it went straight to voicemail. He had blocked me. That was all the confirmation I needed. My own brother, who I had grown up with, shared childhood with, had known I was in a coma. And instead of worrying about me, instead of waiting to see if I would wake up, he had made peace with my death. And then he had moved on. I needed answers. I needed to see it with my own eyes. I didn't have a car anymore. The one I had been driving was probably sitting in some junkyard, crumpled into an unrecognizable heap. So I took a bus, then another, then walked the last few blocks until I stood in front of my parents' house. Everything looked the same. The neatly trimmed lawn, the same old porch, the windows reflecting the afternoon sun. It was the house I had spent my childhood in, the house where I had celebrated birthdays, eaten family dinners, fought with Chris over stupid things. But now, it felt like a stranger's home. My legs felt like lead as I stepped onto the porch. My hand hovered over the doorbell before I forced myself to press it. I heard footsteps. The door opened, and there they were. My mother gasped when she saw me. Her hands flew to her mouth, eyes wide with shock. My father stood behind her, his face frozen in disbelief. For a split second, I let myself hope that they had regretted everything, that they had spent the past few weeks grieving, wondering if I would ever come back to them. But then my father recovered, and the first words out of his mouth were not, "Thank God you're okay." They were not, "We missed you." Instead, he said something about how this was unexpected. Unexpected. Like I was an inconvenience. Like I was the problem here. My mother tried to mask her expression, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She said something about how they had been so worried, how it was such a miracle that I was standing there. But she was lying. I could see it in the way she wouldn't meet my gaze, in the way she fidgeted with her hands. I stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. My legs felt weak, my whole body still recovering, but my mind was sharp. I wasn't here to play their game. The house was pristine, just like always. Except something was off. There were new photos on the walls. Updated family pictures, my parents, my brother. But none of me. It was as if I had never existed. And then I noticed something that sent a fresh wave of nausea rolling through my stomach. Chris had a new house key sitting in the dish by the door. My parents must have noticed my expression because my father quickly started explaining. He said something about how Chris had been struggling financially and how they had helped him out. I didn't need to hear any more. I already knew. Chris had my money. My savings, my investments, my emergency fund, everything I had worked for, everything I had built over the years, had been handed over to him. While I had been lying in a hospital bed, hooked up to machines, barely clinging to life, they had been raiding my accounts. I barely remember how I got the full story out of them. I don't know if it was the exhaustion, the shock, or the anger burning inside me, but somehow I made them talk. They had petitioned for financial guardianship over my assets. They had gone to court, presented documents, claimed I was permanently incapacitated, and that they needed access to my finances for responsible management. It wasn't even hard for them. The system had made it easy. They had signed some paperwork, made a few statements, and just like that, my entire financial life was handed over to them. And they had wasted no time using it. They had cleared out my accounts. My savings, my stocks, my investments all liquidated. My brother had taken the biggest cut. He had bought himself a house, a brand new car, and dumped a huge chunk of the money into some half-baked business idea. My parents hadn't been left out either. They had used my money to pay off their mortgage, to fund renovations, to splurge on things they had apparently been waiting years to afford. And not once did they stop to think about what would happen if I woke up. Because they didn't think I would. They had made their peace with it. Mourned me, but only in the most convenient way. They hadn't cried over my hospital bed, hadn't prayed for my recovery. They had just written me off as a lost cause and moved on. Like I was nothing more than an account balance waiting to be drained. And when I did wake up, they didn't even bother to check. They had never planned to give anything back. Not a dime. Not an apology. Nothing. Standing there in the house I had once called home, listening to them try to justify what they had done, I felt something inside me shift. I had always known my family wasn't perfect. But this wasn't just neglect. This wasn't just favoritism toward my brother. This was betrayal on the deepest level. They had stolen everything from me, and they thought they could get away with it. My mother, still trying to keep up appearances, said something about how Chris needed the money more than I did. She told me I would understand. She told me I should be grateful because at least the money had gone to help family. Grateful? For what? For waking up to find my entire life erased? For learning that my own family had written me off before I had even taken my last breath? For discovering that I had been replaced before my body was even cold? I didn't say anything else. I just turned and walked out the door because they had made one critical mistake. They thought they had one. They thought I was powerless. They thought I would let them get away with it. They were wrong. I wasn't going to scream. I wasn't going to beg. I was going to get everything back. I walked away from that house with a storm brewing inside me. My legs were still weak from the hospital, but adrenaline kept me steady. Every step I took away from them, my mind sharpened. I replayed everything in my head, piecing together the full picture of what they had done. They had buried me. They had gone through the legal system, petitioned for control over my finances, and systematically drained everything I had built over the years. They had done it cleanly. By the time I woke up, there wasn't a single dollar left in my name, and every trace of my financial existence had been wiped away like I never mattered. They had planned for a future without me in it, and they were so sure I wouldn't wake up that they didn't even prepare for the possibility that I might come back. That was their first mistake. Their second mistake? Leaving a trail. Because people like them, people who think they're untouchable, always get sloppy. I spent the next few days digging. I had nothing but the clothes on my back and whatever documents I could find from my hospital discharge papers, but I wasn't done yet. The first place I went was the courthouse. I had never been the kind of person to deal with legal matters before, but now I had no choice. I requested to see the petition my parents had filed to gain control over my finances. I had to wait hours, sitting in a stuffy waiting room, running through every possible scenario in my head. And then, when I finally got the documents, I felt my stomach drop. The lies were right there in black and white. They had declared me permanently incapacitated, not just in a coma, but incapable of making decisions for the rest of my life. They had told the court I had no chance of recovery. They had fabricated medical statements, exaggerating my condition to make it seem like I would never wake up. And because I had no one else listed as a beneficiary, they had easily slipped into my financial life like vultures picking apart a corpse. I sat there staring at the papers, my hands tightening around the edges. They hadn't just assumed I was going to die. They had made sure the world believed it. And that wasn't even the worst part. The money was gone. My accounts had been emptied within days of them getting control. It wasn't gradual, like they had been carefully managing my finances. It was immediate, like they had been waiting for the green light to start spending. My savings? Gone. My investments? Cashed out. My emergency fund? Vanished. They had wasted no time erasing everything I had worked for. And Chris had made out like a king. A brand new house, a luxury car, and a business investment, funded entirely by the life I had built for myself. He had benefited the most from my supposed death. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized he hadn't just taken what was handed to him. He had encouraged it. He had stood to gain the most from me being out of the picture. Maybe he had even been the one to push for it. After leaving the courthouse, I went straight to the bank. I needed to see the transactions for myself. I had to argue with the teller at first. My accounts had been closed, so technically I no longer had access, but after explaining that I had been in a coma and that there might have been fraudulent activity, she called over a manager. The manager pulled up my records, and what I saw made my vision blur with rage. The withdrawals had started immediately. Within a week of them getting control, they had taken out thousands. They had moved money into their own accounts, written checks to themselves, and used my credit cards before closing them out entirely. Chris had wired himself a huge chunk, enough for a down payment on a house in one clean transaction. And they hadn't even tried to hide it. The arrogance was staggering. They had been so sure I was gone that they had left every single receipt. I walked out of that bank shaking. I had everything I needed. The court documents, the bank statements, the proof of fraud. But I wasn't ready to make my move yet. Because the thing about revenge, it had to be done right. I started planning. I reached out to a lawyer, one of the few I could afford since I was completely broke. I explained my situation, laying out every ugly detail. At first, he seemed hesitant. Cases like this were messy. There were legal loopholes that my parents could use to justify their actions. But then I showed him the bank records, and his face changed. Because this wasn't just a case of family financial disputes. This was criminal. They had falsified documents. They had committed fraud. They had embezzled money from someone who was medically vulnerable. And that meant they could go to jail. We started the legal process immediately. My lawyer helped me file a lawsuit demanding the return of my stolen assets. But more importantly, he pushed for criminal charges. And that's when everything started unraveling. My parents received court summons within a week. I didn't tell them I was coming for them. I let them find out the hard way, by opening their mail and realizing they were being sued by their own son. Chris got served at his new house. I would have given anything to see his face when he read the lawsuit, the legal jargon spelling out exactly what he had done. And then, the panic started. My mother called me, her voice shaking, trying to put on that same sweet, fake concern she had used when I showed up at their door. She said it was all a misunderstanding, that we could talk about it. I let her talk. I let her beg. And then I told her something that made her go completely silent. I wasn't dropping the case. She went from pleading to furious in an instant. She accused me of being ungrateful, of betraying my own family. But I reminded her that my family would not have left me to rot in a hospital bed while they looted my savings. Family wouldn't have celebrated my death before I was even buried. This wasn't about family anymore. This was about justice. My father tried a different approach. He called and threatened me. He told me I was making a huge mistake, that if this went to court, I would regret it. I told him to go to hell. Chris didn't call at all, because Chris knew. He knew he was screwed. He knew that every single thing he had built was about to come crashing down. And I was going to be the one standing in the wreckage, watching him lose everything. Because this wasn't just about getting my money back. It was about making them feel exactly what I had felt. They had stolen my life. Now, I was going to destroy theirs. I didn't just want my money back. I wanted them to feel the weight of what they had done. The kind of weight that presses down on you in the middle of the night when you can't sleep, that gnaws at the edges of your thoughts no matter how much you try to ignore it. They had taken everything from me without a second thought. So I was going to take everything from them, and I was going to let them do it to themselves. The first step was patience. My parents were already unraveling, scrambling to get ahead of the legal storm heading their way. My mom was panicking, sending me long messages about how family should stick together and how I was being unreasonable. My dad, always the one who thought he could control everything, was trying a different approach. He wasn't just ignoring the lawsuit. He was fighting it. That was the best part, because he thought he could win. He hired a lawyer, someone who probably cost a fortune, and I imagine he told himself that money could make this all go away. That if he threw enough legal jargon at the court, it would intimidate me into backing down. But that was his biggest mistake. By contesting the lawsuit, he opened the floodgates. Instead of making things easier for himself, he gave my lawyer full access to dig deeper. And what we found, it was even worse than I imagined. See, when you steal a dead man's money, you better be damn sure that man stays dead. They had left a trail of fraud and lies, but the best part was that they had been lazy. They didn't just take my money. They had committed tax fraud to cover it up, because you can't just move large sums of money around without the IRS noticing. And my father, in his arrogance, had thought he could get away with cooking the books. He had funneled money through different accounts, moving things around so it didn't look like outright theft. He had filed false tax reports. He had even tried to claim some of the money as a gift from me, as if I had willingly handed over my life savings before mysteriously falling into a coma. The IRS? They don't like that. At all. Once my lawyer handed over the financial evidence to the authorities, things escalated fast. Suddenly, it wasn't just me coming after them. It was the federal government. They weren't just facing a civil lawsuit anymore. Now, there was a criminal investigation, and my father, still believing he could lie his way out of everything, kept digging the hole deeper. Instead of cooperating, he lied to investigators. Instead of admitting what he had done, he forged documents. Every move he made only tightened the noose around his own neck. Chris, on the other hand, was silent. At first, I thought he would try to fight me, the same way my parents had. But he knew. He knew there was no getting out of this. He knew that the house he was living in, the car he was driving, the money he had blown through, it wasn't his. It had been stolen. And stolen money always comes with a price. I got a call from his lawyer, someone he had probably hired last minute in a desperate attempt to save himself. The lawyer was nervous. He wanted to talk, to negotiate. I let him speak. Chris was willing to return whatever he had left. But that was the problem. There was nothing left. The house, already in foreclosure. He hadn't even been able to keep up with the payments. The car, repossessed. The business investment, a total failure. He had poured thousands into a startup that never even got off the ground. Chris had nothing to offer me, and that was exactly what he deserved. My parents tried one last trick. They wanted to settle. They wanted me to drop everything, the lawsuit, the charges, the investigation, in exchange for what? An apology? A fraction of what they had stolen? I let them think I was considering it. I dragged out conversations, pretended to hesitate, let them sweat, and then I did exactly what they had done to me. I left them hanging. I didn't show up to any of the family meetings they tried to arrange. I ignored their messages, let their calls go straight to voicemail. I let them feel what it was like to be completely abandoned. And when the final court date arrived, I showed up. I sat across from them as the judge laid out every single one of their crimes. The embezzlement, the fraud, the forgery, the theft. My father's face was pale. My mother was crying. Chris wouldn't even look at me. The judge ruled in my favor. Every stolen cent had to be returned. Chris lost everything. My parents had to sell their home just to cover what they owed. And that was before the criminal charges kicked in. My father? He was facing prison time. My mother? Complicit in fraud. Chris? Drowning in debt he could never pay back. It was done. They had destroyed themselves. And I hadn't lifted a finger. After the verdict, my mother tried one last time. She approached me in the hallway outside the courtroom, her face streaked with tears. She begged. She said they had nowhere to go, that they would be homeless, that I was ruining them. And for a moment, I almost felt something. Almost. But then I remembered lying in that hospital bed. I remembered waking up alone. I remembered Chris's voice on the phone. "Oh my God, you're alive." And I felt nothing. I turned to her, stared her dead in the eyes, and told her the truth. They had done this to themselves. Then I walked away. My parents lost everything. After selling their house to cover the money they owed, they couldn't afford another place. They downgraded to a cramped apartment on the outskirts of town, barely making ends meet. My father, once so confident, so sure he could manipulate his way out of trouble, had his reputation shattered. Nobody wanted to do business with a man convicted of fraud. Eventually, he ended up in prison. Not for long. White-collar crimes rarely come with lengthy sentences, but long enough to break him. The arrogance, the superiority was gone, replaced with the realization that he wasn't invincible. My mother tried to keep things together, but without my father's income, she struggled. She reached out to me once, asking if I could help her find a job. I didn't respond. Chris was completely ruined. The house, gone. The car, gone. The business, a disaster. He had racked up so much debt trying to maintain a lifestyle that wasn't his that creditors were circling like vultures. He tried to reach out to me too, apologizing, begging, pleading. I ignored him. Last I heard, he was bouncing between jobs, struggling to stay afloat. He had burned every bridge, drained every opportunity, and now, no one was there to save him. They all bet on the idea that I wouldn't wake up. They spent my money like I was never coming back. Now, they're the ones barely surviving. I rebuilt. It wasn't easy, but I did it. And I did it without them. I changed my number. I moved on. Because the thing about betrayal is this. Once you see people for what they really are, there's no going back.